Morning, everyone. Welcome to Places and Spaces. It's not easy being green. It wasn't easy for some people today to wear green. I deliberately said instructions were sent out, please wear green today. Unlike my normal black, I've gone green. Beth followed, but some of the others didn't get the memo. It's green spaces today. And we've got a pretty packed program. What a time to be involved in planning at the moment. There's so much legislation out there, so many changes, so much discussion. The planning infrastructure bill is out there currently doing the rounds. I don't know whether people have looked at it. It is really important to have a read of that bill. The explanatory notes I think they're fuller than the actual bill itself, but very interesting in terms of setting the scene in terms of what government policy is. Key points that I think come from that bill is it's all about the boom. It's all about trying to create an environment that will allow for the housing targets to be met during the course of this government. If you look at the bill, it covers so many things. We go from planning fees, we move into planning committees and what we're going to do in terms of delegated decisions. Masses on strategic planning, very big in terms of if you count the number of times strategic, the word strategic appears in the bill. I think that gives you an indication of the direction of travel that the government policy is taking. Speeding up JR reviews, simplification of CPO, green and brown land development, and the whole nature recovery issue. It's just so much in there. A really, really important, substantial piece of legislation. And my point about reading it is a good one. Not just the bill itself, but there's an impact assessment that I think came out at the beginning of the week, which obviously follows all legislation has an impact assessment, and it's the government essentially looking at the savings or the economic case for the measures that are being proposed. I think it's worth a read because it gives a very, very good background and identifies some of the key thinking that I think will follow the infrastructure bill once it gets through Parliament. So have a read of that. It's the impact assessment. It's easy to access, but it gives some really good examples. What else is happening at the moment? For those of you in mid-Sussex, interesting decision at the beginning of the week. Andy, was it the beginning of the week? Yesterday? Last week. So if you haven't looked at it, it's Scamps Hill, and it's an application that Gladman had in for only 90 units, but it questions whether or not mid-Sussex have got a 5-year housing land supply. And discusses that quite interestingly in terms of talking about the large schemes that are coming forward in that district. But maybe it's if you've got an application ready to go in mid-Sussex, now's the time to get that in. So all of that means that it's a really, really timely opportunity to have the next Places and Spaces seminar. And it's a packed programme today. Usual panel. We've got Lord Andy Black with us from the fantastic Andrew Black Associates, but I've got to say there are other planning associates available, so I just have to put that in. Also with us again, Dame Beth Gascoyne from the fantastic Cripps planning team. And at that point, I say there aren't any other fantastic planning teams available. But we're also joined today by Eleanor Trenfield from the Landscaped Architects EDLA. and we're looking to talk to you a bit later about the importance of design and from an early stage about how design impacts schemes, not just as an afterthought, but right at the beginning. For those who are interested, Eleanor does have a dog called Stanley. He's sitting outside waiting very patiently for Mum to finish, and hopefully we will introduce him a bit later. But before we get to Eleanor, we've got Andy, who's going to be talking all green. Or is it grey, Andy?
Green and grey.
Green, maybe it's golden. Maybe it's the golden rules. He's going to navigate us through some of the issues in landscape and open space. Beth's going to take a closer look at the local nature recovery strategy, the Nature Restoration Fund, and some of the proposals that are sitting in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. We talked in the last session about some of the challenges that development and developers are facing in terms of water neutrality and nitrate neutrality, and that is addressed in the bill in quite an interesting way. Before all of that, want to stress, if you've got questions, send them in. The more difficult ones are going to go to Andy. The easy ones are going to come to Beth and me, but we want to see them come through if you can. I always tell people that my mum watches this program. She's not today, but she normally watches, and she's 95 and gets a question in. So shame on everyone if you can't get a question in today. Right, Andy, we're going to start with you, and you are, as I say, going full green on it, and giving us a bit of an update in terms of where we are with green, grey, and golden.
Great. Thanks, James. So what you didn't mention at the start of this is obviously the title of this seminar, It's Not Easy Being Green, is the title of, I think, one of the best songs from one of the best albums of all time by one of my favourite artists. So that artist is Kermit the Frog. The album is the Muppet Show record. It's a fantastic album, great song. And I was looking at the lyrics of that song, and here's a great verse from it. I can't sing, I'm not my singing voice at this time of the morning, but it says, "It seems you blend in with so many other ordinary things, and people tend to pass you over because you're not standing out." All right. So I think today we want to go into talking about some of the bits of the NPPF and making sure that maybe we aren't passed over at Appeal, and that maybe we are standing out on certain things. So I want to go into this with my hero of Kermit the Frog in the front of our mind. So we're going to talk through some of the bits this morning on grey belts, and I think we all know what grey belt now means and the definition of it, but we want to hone in, and with the benefit of Eleanor here, to start talking about some of those other bits of what you need to do in terms of grey belt, the footnotes, and particularly some of the requirements around green spaces. So there's a definition of grey belt. We'll come back to some of the bits that we've now got the benefit of in terms of planning practice guidance around what it really means to strongly contribute to those purposes. And we know, of course, that we've got the footnotes in the framework in footnote 7, and it gives you the fact that you have to have a strong reason for refusing or restricting development. We know most of those, and obviously excludes greenbelt. There's two elements of that, though, that's worth just talking about and thinking about, and we're starting to see every day, every week, more and more appeals coming through on some of these things. But two bits in there that I just wanted to focus in on and hone in on. One of the footnote 7 assets is local green space, and the other one is national landscapes, the AONBs, and both of those are quite important elements when we're looking at what could be grey belt sites. Local green spaces are something that's come through. There's a fair bit actually in the framework on local green spaces and how they are defined. We quite frequently find local green spaces being identified in neighbourhood plans. The neighbourhood plan areas are a big fan of trying to get as much local green space as possible. And there's a fair bit of guidance on that, and the guidance has firmed up over the years to make sure, as you can see in paragraph 107 there, that you really should only be designating it where it's close to that community, it's special to that community, it holds a particular local significance, it's local in character, it's not extensive tracts of land. But nevertheless, you can find that sites are designated as local green space in neighbourhood plans. I've had clients send me things that had all the attributes of grey belt land, but have got effectively a green space, local green space definition in a neighbourhood plan or even in a local plan. So it's a really important bit to look at. It's also, I think, what we're going to see is as we go into that new phase of plan making, neighbourhood plans coming through, I highly suspect that we're going to see more applications to make things local green space because it's a key area of protection of it. We also know around, as I highlighted there, elements of AONB and that being a footnote 7. There has been some authority from appeals on that, which we'll go into. Obviously, it's a wider designation. You'll have a site that sits within a national landscape. However, individual sites are often going to be local green spaces. So as a footnote 7, marker down. It's worth not forgetting around what local green spaces are, but also when you're in that plan making process, beware local green spaces because they're out there. Moving on, we're pretty familiar now with effectively what the golden rules say, and in terms of complying with that, Part A, affordable housing, we know it's 50% or 15% uplift. Fairly easy to get that and to achieve that, well, in theory, to get to that number and to tick that box. Improvements to local infrastructure, national infrastructure, again, that's something that can be relatively easily achieved. It's Part C of this that I really wanted to look at today, and again, with the benefit of Eleanor, we're going to unpick some of this. So Part C talks about provision of new or improvements to existing green spaces that are accessible to the public and new residents being able to access those within a short walk, and it can be on-site or it can be off-site. That's what Part C says of 156, and it's thinking about what that really means in terms of paragraph. And actually what we do have is a couple of paragraphs later in the NPPF, a further explanation of what that means. And it tells us, and it says the improvements to local green space, to green spaces that are required should contribute positively to the landscape setting of the development. So again, right from that outset, making sure that we are clear and understand and have signposted what the landscape setting is of any development. Supporting nature recovery, Beth's going to take us through that. We're going to talk about that a bit more. And then meeting local standards for green space provision where this exists in the development plan. So you've got to go off, you've got to look at what it says around green space provision, around open space, around leaps, around laps. And then it says, well, look, where you don't have those standards, or maybe even where they're out of date, you're looking at the standards that Natural England set out in terms of green space and urban greening and the green flag criteria. And then it finally says, and again, this comes back to local nature recovery strategies, talking about land having been identified for that. Proposals should contribute towards those outcomes. So we've got some quite clear guidance on what we need to do for improvements to green spaces. There's some additional planning practice guidance around that and what it says around how major development can effectively contribute to accessible green space. And it sets out a number of bullet points there, which I won't go through in detail, but it talks about green spaces should include active travel routes, so you've got to be able to get to them effectively. Accessible green spaces, whereas of vegetation sets out in landscape townscape, it can include blue space as well. So you're talking about potentially integrating rivers and areas of drainage within that, all kind of important bits. So we're getting this kind of guidance with the NPPG that starts to talk about that. And it also says that the community infrastructure levy can be used to fund those improvements to existing green spaces or the provision of new ones. So again, we can start to be looking at how sill could be used in theory to other green spaces. So there's some quite helpful guidance that's starting to come through on that. That guidance that talks about where you haven't got local planning policies. Natural England have that guidance. It's the Green Infrastructure Standards for England that's set out in this document, and it is quite a good document. Actually, I had a flick through it, and there's some quite detailed elements within that, and it gives you those figures around green spaces, around distances, around maximum journey times, around sizes, and you've got this kind of hierarchy of doorstep green space, local green space, neighbourhood, wider neighbourhood, district, sub-regional green space, and making sure that we're contributing to those. And we'll see this becoming more and more now as we're looking at new local plans, and this being embedded in new local plans, because it's important that kind of reads right the way through. And again, urban greening factor and how that works, and talking about the urban greening requirements on site. Again, Eleanor will help us unpick this a bit later, but meeting those requirements. And this is all about, really, in my mind, making sure that when you've got a planning application, you are you're signposting all of that within your application, where you're saying, we're a grey belt site, we're meeting those golden rules. In my mind, you want to be going into that real detail of saying, well, this is how we meet it. Okay. So, and again, the green flag criteria, this is the green flag awards, and this is what the criteria set out for the judging panel, and this is referenced in the NPPF, of those criteria of having kind of healthy, safe and secure places, maintenance, management of them, community involvement, biodiversity, landscape, all of that wrapped up to give you that sort of high bar of local space. So it's not just about having, there's an area of green space, there it is, tick the box. It's more than that. It's about making sure that you are signposting how you are complying with those parts. We're going to talk a little bit more about this again with Eleanor, but with the planning practice guidance being updated, it's starting to tell us more and more now about what you need to be doing to have a strong contribution. And we've got some important guidance there, which probably won't go through in detail, but worth looking at. And the important bit of that also is that the government have been very clear that villages shouldn't be considered as large built-up areas. We're not talking about unrestricted sprawl of villages, we're talking about unrestricted sprawl of towns. And that's something that, in terms of the planning practice guidance, we know that has the same weight as what's in the NPPF. So all of this is really important, and all of this is going to be what decision makers will have in front of them when they are deciding whether something makes a strong contribution or not. And it should be front and centre when we are putting together a planning application of saying, right, this site, where does it fit into this? Clearly, if you're making a strong contribution, then you're not grey belt. But if you're moderate or weak or none, then you're complying. And again, they've done the same for Purpose B and also for Purpose D as well. We won't spend too much time on those. We've got a lot to get through this morning. Some appeal decisions. So I talked about AUMB, and here's an interesting appeal decision that people may be aware of, but I'm going to flag it anyway. This is a site in Abingdon in South Oxfordshire, and the application was for a solar farm, quite a large solar farm, with also what you get now, battery storage and other elements within that. And it was in the AUMB, and the council refused it. And before it went to inquiry, the appellant and SODC effectively agreed through statement of common ground that it met all the criteria of grey belt, that it was grey belt development, that it performed poorly against those purposes. And there's the layouts of a substantial area of land, and the inspector, in going through that decision, and it's worth a read in full, but effectively said, look, I've got common ground that it meets the definition of grey belt. And even then, after that, after the inquiry closed, paragraph 5 of that allowed the parties the ability to look at what the planning practice guidance said. They continued to agree that it would meet the definition of grey belt, and therefore that appeal was allowed. So it shows that, again, one of the few appeal decisions we've got at the moment that talks about AONB, but it shows that as a footnote, just because you're in AONB doesn't mean that it's no dice when it comes to grey belt. It means that you've got to look at those parts, and you've got to make that decision of whether it provides a strong reason.
I think your comment that it's helpful to read that decision is a good one, because it very clearly sets out the thinking and the reasoning behind the decision in a very informed way. It is a good read in answering that question in terms of impact on the ONB as well.
Yeah, and I think we'll see more of those appeals come through, and we'll see inevitably other appeals in the AONB and decisions coming through when we're having to grapple with those matters. The other appeal that references green space, the only other one that's out there at the moment, is this site in Hadlow. This is in Tonbridge and Malling.
I did the section 106.
Oh yeah, it's a really good section 106 on this one, apparently. Yeah, it's great. So this was an application by Dan Dara for a medium-sized development, 57 dwellings, and then there's also a day nursery preschool on that site. And we've got some details of it. That's the site there on the edge of a fairly small settlement, and it was owned by or part of land holdings for Hadlow Horticultural College. And it was effectively redundant land surrounded by kind of houses and development on three sides there, as you can see. And it was agreed that it met the definition of grey belt land. There's clearly a need in Tonbridge and Malling. They don't have a 5-year housing land supply. And so it effectively landed then, it met that definition, passed the criterion 155. You're into paragraph 156. You're into golden rules. It was applying 50% affordable housing. That was all signposted and agreed. Local infrastructure improvements, all fine. But it's one of the only ones where an inspector's gone into that level of detail of what it really meant in terms of green space. So there's the layout of the site. You've got the housing in the middle there, and then large areas of green space. You can see the area of suds kind of drainage to the south, and then to the west of that site, areas of green space, but also kind of you've got play areas within there integrated, and then these linkages through from the existing residential housing over to the west. And the inspector gave this a fairly decent look within the appeal decision and said, look, in terms of that third contribution and making those improvements to green spaces, he referenced what the framework says, and he said, look, in this respect, the proposal has adequate provision for open space and children's play space. It's accessible to those prospective residents, but also those living nearby, and talked about pedestrian access from those that existing community, and then talked about planning obligations and having management of that on-site open space, and then contributions to off-site space as well, to sites that were nearby within the vicinity, and said, okay, we can tick that box from that side. So sure, I went too far there. So that's a very quick run through, James, Beth and Eleanor, of what we've got there. Going back to that, I think it's all, in my mind, about that signposting. I think we've got to be really clear when we're coming forward with those applications, why we're ticking those boxes, why we're doing that. And I think you've got to expect that actually, so far to date, this is all we've got in terms of those appeal decisions. I think we're due some, certainly for larger applications, for ones that are maybe more controversial, for ones that go to full-on inquiry. I can envisage that this is going to come under a fair bit more scrutiny from inspectors, and equally from councils as well, to want to be really clear that, okay, you've got an area of open space, how does it comply with standards? How does it do all those bits? Because I think that behoves those decision makers to do that, and I think this is what it could really come down to. So my kind of takeaway from this today is that this is something that's in there. We need to fully understand it, and I think it's a really important aspect of it.
When you read the appeal decision, I think it feeds really neatly into what we're going to be talking about with Eleanor shortly, which is that design is king. Design is so important. As you read out the inspector's view of the application, so much was about how it was designed and the importance of getting design right at the beginning, right at the outset, not as an afterthought, because it shapes how that application is viewed. Andy, you talked about villages and towns. Now, is there a definition of a village? What are we talking about here? Are we a post office and a pub, or?
Yeah, I mean, in practice guidance and in the NPPF, we don't have a definition of villages. So it's what the council might say. You can look at things in terms of the settlement hierarchy and how things are looked at in there. But we're finding now most councils are agreeing maybe it's not a village, but certainly it's not a town. You can get to a point where it's agreed this isn't a town. It's not a large built-up area.
I mean, it's an important question because it carves out potentially a whole raft of areas that would be exempt. So I'd be interested to anyone's views on that as to what a village is, or how that is being viewed. Also interesting on the AONB, I think I've talked before about an inquiry that I was involved in, where in the cross-examination, the council were the development was just outside the AONB, but it was about the impact on the AONB, and the council's planning officer was saying, was asked the question whether or not you could see the development. It was a concrete batching plant. Could you see the development from the AONB? And he accepted that you couldn't see the development at any point from the AONB, and was then asked the question, well, how does it impact the AONB, and why is it detrimental? And he said, because I know it's there, which always made me giggle, and it always sort of comes back to
just because you can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't have impact. And that's the whole thing in terms of like landscape, character impact and visual impact. There's still impact, even if it's not necessarily visible.
Yeah, this was talking about how it impacted on the AONB. I accept the point, but I just thought it was a very nice little comment. And that was the inspector actually asking him that question. Thanks, Andy, and we'll come back to that as we talk more with Eleanor. But Beth's going to give us a bit of an overview on local nature recovery strategies, nature restoration fund. But before that, I thought I mentioned at the beginning the impact assessment that accompanies the bill and why it's interesting. But the impact assessment, when talking about nature restoration fund, tries to summarise what the problem is, and I'll briefly quote from it. So the problem under consideration, it says, is to deliver a win-win for the environment and growth. There we go, growth again. The government needs an alternative to the current approach for how development meets relevant environmental obligations. As things stand, the current system often fails to support required development because it necessarily focuses too heavily on avoiding any harmful impacts of individual developments, and includes the requirement to put in place project-specific mitigations before planning consent can be granted. And then it goes on to talk about the problems of delay and of the costly impact of doing things in a piecemeal fashion. But it's pretty central to that part of the bill. Beth, how are you going to lead us through this?
Well, I'm going to talk about two pieces of legislation, actually. The first one's slightly more historic, but not particularly in terms of the speed in which parts have been put in force. But it's the General Biodiversity Duty and Nature Recovery under the Environment Act 2021. And then I'm going to move on to, as James has already trailed, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. In terms of the general biodiversity duty and nature recovery under the Environment Act, this extended biodiversity duty for public authorities. So, for us, that would be the local authorities, which came into force on the 1st of January 2023. Section 40 extends the biodiversity duty on public authorities, and it puts them under a proactive duty to, from time to time, consider what action the authority can properly take consistently with the proper exercise of its functions to further the general biodiversity objective, and to take a strategic approach to determine policies and specific objectives for taking action to further the general biodiversity objective. So the government's aim for this extended objective is to provide for the enhancement as well as improvement, the enhancement and improvement of biodiversity. So it's going beyond what was previously there, which was the maintenance of biodiversity in its current state. Sitting alongside this duty are local nature recovery strategies, LNRSs, which I'm going to trip up over saying, so I'll probably just call them strategies. But these strategies are intended to complement and focus the biodiversity duties on public authorities by setting out where and how action can be taken to support nature. The intention is for there to be 48 strategies in total, covering the whole of the country with no gaps or overlaps. All responsible authorities will, and these will typically be county councils and some unitary authorities, so it's not quite the same strategic level that you're looking at with the delivery plan. So they're kind of that's the tier you're at. So county and unitary authority level are now preparing their LNRSs with some draft strategies emerging. The first one for the West of England was published in November last year, and we're told to expect the rest this year. The intention is for each LNRS to suggest the best actions in the best locations, from small nature-friendly adjustments to farming practices to large-scale habitat restoration. So, for example, an LNRS may suggest where and what trees could be planted on a piece of land to help slow the flow of water into rivers, which could then in turn reduce flooding onto more kind of productive land downstream. Despite being in the early stages of implementation, these strategies have the potential to significantly shape the planning system. The updated updated guidance, the PPG, confirms that LNRS will serve as an evidence base, which contains information that may be a material consideration in planning decisions and local plan making. Specifically, paragraph 47 of the PPG states that it's for the decision maker to determine what is a relevant material consideration based on the individual circumstances of the case. And the guidance adds, in case there is a draft local nature recovery strategy that has been consulted upon but not yet finalised and published, the draft strategy may contain useful essential information that can support appropriate decision making. In paragraph 46, the PPG states that LPA should consider the priorities set out in the relevant local nature recovery strategy when determining how their local plan should contribute to and enhance the local and natural environment. The PPG further states that LNRSs can inform the preparation of neighbourhood plans and spatial development strategies. However, despite the guidance so far produced to date, there is still some uncertainty around the weight that LNRSs will carry in the planning process. So in respect of this element, practical advice at this stage is for developers and landowners to take opportunities to engage with LNRSs. For example, early engagement may provide an opportunity to influence emerging strategy priorities before they're finalised. It may provide opportunities to align site promotion with LNRS objectives, such as integrating off-site biodiversity enhancements or guiding the provision of what on-site green infrastructure is provided. All these things can help de-risk planning applications and also demonstrate positive environmental outcomes in connection with the development. Engagement can also provide opportunities for landowners to identify new biodiversity investment opportunities. So we've got that running along this year. Alongside that, and as James has mentioned, we've got the Planning and Infrastructure Bill proposals. It covers a lot, this bill. Part 2 relates to planning, which I guess is where we're focused. And given that Chapter 2 of Part 2 officially brings strategic planning back into the English planning system, I think it's safe to assume we'll probably be folding this into content for a future Places and Spaces podcast. But today it's Part 3 that we're looking at, as it deals with nature restoration and introduces environmental delivery plans. These are plans which are to be prepared by Natural England to provide a structured approach to biodiversity planning, and perhaps form the most complicated provisions in the entire draft legislation, having tried to wrestle with it over the past week. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill will, in summary, provide the necessary legislative framework for a move to a strategic approach to nature recovery, which is managed and delivered by government bodies, or the state. I think you like the reference to the state, working in partnership with private providers and funded through a nature recovery levy on new developments. The main purpose of these reforms, we are told, is twofold. So we have, firstly, it's there to assist in removing hurdles to delivery of homes and significant infrastructure projects. And I think it's probably safe to say we've all been kind of witness to the complications and the difficulties involved dealing with issues such as nitrate neutrality and water neutrality. For example, currently if a development is proposed near a protected site, additional costs and delays can arise where, for example, you've got an appropriate assessment is required, you've got detailed surveys which are required, which may need to be carried out at certain times of the year. There may be need for on-site mitigation measures or licenses to undertake investigations from Natural England. And then you've got the complications arise where there aren't on-site mitigation measures available, and you've got lack of off-site mitigation measures as well. Secondly, and no less importantly, the government stressed the reforms are also to deal with environmental harms at source on a strategic scale, and they're looking to achieve better environmental outcomes alongside development growth. So what will EDPs look like? Environmental delivery plans are intended to set out in relation to an area and a type of development, the environmental features likely to be negatively affected by the development, the conservation measures that are to be taken by or on behalf of Natural England to protect those environmental features, the amount of nature restoration levy payable by developers to Natural England to cover the cost of those conservation measures, and the environmental obligations in relation to that development, which would be discharged, disapplied or modified if the levy is paid by the developer. EDPs can include a combination of mitigation and compensation, as well as on-site measures. A draft EDP prepared by Natural England will only come into force if it's made by the Secretary of State, so it's following the same process that you do for local plan making, and can only be made by the Secretary of State if the Secretary of State considers the EDP passes the overall improvement test, i.e. if conservation measures are likely to be sufficient to outweigh the negative effect caused by the environmental impact of the development. Only once the Secretary of State has approved or made the EDP, once the Secretary of State has made or approved the EDP, there will be a defined 6-week JR period. This will run from the date of publication of the EDP, or alternatively from the decision to not make the EDP, or any decisions on amendments, etc., or revocation, after which the notes accompanying the bill say it will not be possible to then challenge an individual development on this basis at the grant of planning permission stage. The explanatory notes to the bill will also explain that Natural England will be given new compulsory purchase powers to acquire land where it's needed in order for it to deliver the required environmental outcomes set out in the EDP, and this will be subject to authorisation by the Secretary of State. I think we need a lot more detail in relation to these provisions to understand exactly how and when they're going to work. And what about the levy? So once an EDP is in place and the developer wants to bring forward a scheme in an affected area, in most circumstances they would have a choice. They could either commit to pay the levy, so the nature restoration levy for the developments, in which cases the relevant restrictions on development posed by the Habitat Regulations or the Wildlife and Countryside Act would be disregarded, or they could continue under the current system, under which they need to provide site-specific mitigation for their development proposals. The bill does, however, allow an EDP to make payment of the new levy mandatory for specific environmental effects. So if this was the case, you would lose the opportunity to continue under the current system with site-specific mitigation. But Natural England would have to justify why it was doing this, and the Secretary of State would then have to approve it while making the EDP. And finally, do we think it will work? Will it remove barriers to development delivery? So from the detail that we have so far, it's uncertain how quickly EDPs can be put in place. The idea is to develop these in parallel with the progress of the bill. So at the point at which the bill is in force, we have these plans in place, but the preparation is unlikely to be a quick fix. There will be complex issues to resolve, and a lot will be dependent on the resources of Natural England. There will be, I suspect, some uncertainty regarding viability issues and funding. And there is the potential also for unfairness at individual site level. For example, if there's no individual site assessment, there may lack some proportionality in terms of the levy amount to the harm caused by development. If and when if a development levy is to become mandatory, this also removes flexibility to deal with issues at a site-specific level, and it may stifle innovation and neutralise any site-specific advantage, both from a practical perspective and an ecological perspective. It's difficult to see at this stage how the charging schedule for the levy will be planned and developed, and there are likely, in a similar way to SIL, be complexities associated with collection and enforcement. So I think, as is often the case, the devil will be in the detail, and the success of these measures will likely depend on the level at which the levy rates are set. It may depend on the extent at which any mandatory participation is required, and the clarity and effectiveness of EDPs in addressing specific environmental impacts, particularly regarding timing and delivery.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, Beth. Thank you. I mean, I think the word I've written down is just incredibly ambitious in terms of what is being proposed. Again, when you look at the impact assessment, it talks about these measures being in place within 3 months of primary legislation being passed, and for the need for subsequent legislation to be introduced to cover some of the areas. It is incredibly ambitious in exactly the same way as the numbers of houses that the government wants to see in the 5 years. I'm going back to that impact assessment, and this kind of summarizes for me or illustrates to me the ambitiousness of it. It says, where a delivery plan is in place, developers will be able to pay into the NRF to enable a delivery body to carry out appropriate interventions at a strategic level. Responsibility for the delivery will be shifted to the public sector, with the delivery body producing a delivery plan covering a certain geographical area and topics that set out strategic measures to address the impacts of development and work towards nature recovery. Now, all of that apparently is going to be 3 months, but at least it's trying to address the issue and trying to find a solution to what is a major barrier in a number of a number of areas. Andy's telling me to get on. Just wonder why he's looking at me that way. I was going to just say that we'd had a couple of comments in on villages. I will just quickly mention them. I think, but they're both serious. But it's an interesting one from Simon Potts, where he asked the question: how do you deal with what is perceived as a village that has been absorbed into a town by urban sprawl? I think that's a very interesting
really good question, actually.
Christian Morris with again a pertinent comment: doesn't a town have a town council? Villages, parish councils. That's one of the things we were talking about.
Yeah.
He also suggests that towns have a Greggs, but villages don't. I should say,
I'm willing to do some research on that, actually, for the sake of planning, James. So yeah, leave it with me.
Right, come on, we've got to get on to Eleanor. Eleanor's a chartered landscape architect. She specialises in landscape planning. She's co-founder and director of the architectural practice
Landscape
architectural practice EDLA, based in Kent. And you deal with a whole range of really quite complex sites throughout the southeast. I mentioned when Andy finished that design was king, and I know that's a key thing that you talk about. You've got some examples, I think, of some of the projects that you're working on, which are lovely. I think some of the the design is really quite beautiful in terms of what you've done. I am going to give people, can you remember in the 80s or 80s or 90s, CDs used to have a warning sticker on them for parental advisory if there was some heavy rap lyrics or something. I am just going to give a spoiler alert. One of the schemes includes Millwall Football Club.
Ooh.
So if you're sensitive in that direction, then I'm warning you now. But joking apart, Eleanor, do you want to talk us through some of your schemes? Because I think the design speaks for itself, and the importance of the design shines through.
Thank you very much. So, how do I? Sorry. Oh, is that changing? Yes. As James has very kindly introduced us, we're landscape architects. We specialise in landscape planning and landscape design. So we're really keen to get in early on sites and provide that strategic early advice in terms of what the sensitivities are, both from a visual impact perspective and landscape character perspective, and how development could best and most sensitively be accommodated on a site. So development can happen. We believe development is positive, but it's about where and how it comes forward, which we can really support. I've got some great projects. We're so privileged to work on so many interesting projects and a wide range of projects as well. This is a community first kind of pedestrian first self-build project in Kent, which we've won awards for recently. And it's really trying to create the fabric for communities to create their own create their own spaces and sense of belonging. We've got kind of quite interesting ideas. We're working with a Dutch developer who's bringing lots of these interesting kind of views from Holland across. So how to create meaningful spaces and how to give people autonomy over how they design their homes as well. We work on later living projects. This is a quarry, an existing quarry in Kent, which is now the most beautiful lake, really high water quality, and we're looking at putting in retirement living within this site. This is a brownfield site. We're working with a really good developer, Esquire Developments, and we're putting in really high quality residential homes and lots of open space. We work very closely with ecologists as well to identify what are the sensitivities on site and how can we bring these forward and create places that people and nature can thrive. That's what we're really interested in. We're working on projects in Ebbsfleet as well, including this, which is a community hub, which is now on site at the moment, very exciting. So creating outdoor amphitheatre spaces connected to community centres right on the route to school. So bringing in kind of edible Ebbsfleet so children can pick fruit and learn about food and growing food on their way to school. And there's lots of really fun ideas in there. This is Millwall Football Club's training ground. So this is in Greenbelt. And I take it you're not a fan of Millwall.
I didn't mention that. I was just giving a warning. It's everybody hates them. We all know that.
They don't care though.
But this is a really interesting project from a Greenbelt point of view, looking at the very special circumstances as well. And what we did within this project as well was really advise from a very early stage where pitches should go, where the indoor training ground should go, how the development could be mitigated, and all these things, working with the landscape as well, acoustics, ecology, all these things which are kind of wrapped up into a development constraints. And we've worked on the Betzanger Sea Hive Wave Garden, which I hear has an excellent Section 106, Beth.
Not another. Come on.
Great Section 106.
And then also buildings in Podium Gardens, urban realm in London. Regeneration projects. This one is one of the most amazing places. an old locomotive shed site with huge amount of public realm proposed. It's being converted into residential and then film studios as well. And then something we're getting increasingly more interest in and more inquiries on is also storage and distribution. This is a quite a large site as well, which we've worked on, and the buildings themselves are coming forward on storage and distribution up to about 24 meters in height now, because of all the machinery that's required internally. And to future-proof them. So you're looking at very significant visual impacts with these, which are quite interesting to work through in terms of testing colorations, in terms of wider distance views, and not just looking at the gradients as you're going along the motorway. It's about those wider views from more sensitive locations, which are really interesting as well from our perspective.
I mentioned at the beginning about the importance about design is king and how important it is to get involved right at the beginning. LVIAs, landscape and visual impact assessments, I mean, they're required for every application. It's really important that they are the focus of the application and lead the design and lead the project. Is that your take on things as well?
Yes, absolutely. Most development we work on is subject to LVIA and or townscape assessment, but it's not just an assessment for us. And I think when it's done well, it's ensuring sensitivity and a sensitive response to local landscape and impacts are reduced as far as possible. So the final product is an assessment, great, but it's also the iterative tool that's really valuable in our process, and working with Andy and wider design teams, we can really inform and make sure that development is sensitive to its location.
Okay, I'm going to push on a little bit in terms of it's important that message about design really informing the layout right from the beginning. But what about what's additional work required on greenbelt, and how does greybelt differ?
Okay, so we undertake LVA on all sites, including greenbelt sites, and then with greenbelt sites, there's just an extra layer of assessment that we undertake. And we're looking at the openness of the site and how the site contributes to the purposes of greenbelt as set out in 143. And we look at each of those in turn. We also look at the wider assessments that have been undertaken by local authorities, and we make a conclusion in terms of how the site contributes to the greenbelt. Parallel to this, Andy and his peers, you're working up the VSC cases.
Yep.
So in terms of VSC cases, what we can support with in terms of landscape design and all the landscape input is helping to elevate the site from more than just a good landscape design. We can do much more. So on some projects, for example, Millwall, we're achieving really high BNG. On some projects we're achieving more than 20%, which is going towards the VSCs, providing specific new community facilities that are really valuable, and also high quality design is also being identified in some decisions as part of the VSCs, which is really interesting. So we're here to support that. From a grey belt perspective, what we're looking at now is actually it's a different kind of assessment process. Firstly, we start with only assessing 3 of the NPPF purposes. So it's A, to check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, B, to prevent neighbouring towns merging into one another, and D, to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. And I think, as Andy said, it's really interesting that it's very specific, the fact that it's focused on towns for all these purposes, which leaves, for me, if my understanding, leaves villages very highly exposed. Here we go. So as I won't talk about these again, Andy's mentioned them, but just highlighted the fact that they're not including villages in terms of how you would assess this through the PPG guidance.
But those illustrative features are very interesting to read. It's quite a lot of detail there in terms of really helping you make the assessment as to whether A, B or D.
Could I ask a question as well? On this? So we know that in order to comply with grey belt, it mustn't serve a strong purpose, right? Then what was the point in putting moderate on there as well? And why do we? Is that just to sort of show that there is surely if it's not strong, then it doesn't matter in grey belt, or does it matter that something might be moderate?
I think for me, I use it as a gauge to help me identify what is moderate and what is weak or none. So if it came out as moderate or weak or none, it's therefore not strong. So that would be how I would look at it and how it helps me. But in your wider question, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's not necessary for what you need, but
Yeah.
for an assessor, it's the more guidance I can have as an assessor, the better. Then we're kind of jumping onto footnote 7. And this list is short. It does not include local designations for scenic quality. So in areas, we've got projects such as areas of high landscape value, and those are not included in footnote 7. So they're fairly exposed. And it doesn't include the setting of national designations. So as you were saying, James, you're looking at development and setting of AONB. This is not included here. It's either in national landscape or it's not, as far as I read it. So by this approach, if you're looking at a village in a local scenic designation on the edge of a national landscape, it would still be within grey belt, which is quite a significant change to where we were before.
Yeah.
Then we jump onto paragraph 155, and this is about how would it fundamentally undermine the purposes taken altogether of the remaining green belt across the area of the plan? So this is where we look wider and think how are we really changing that wider function of the green belt? And a few fields on the edge of a village are not going to change that wider purpose fundamentally. And then the interesting part that we were going to unpick today is 159 and these golden rules, and contributing positively to landscape setting. We are already doing this, and we should be anyway within good design. And we use the LVIA process to demonstrate that and to iterate and improve the design from that perspective. Support nature recovery, we should already be doing this through BNG anyway, and the other things that are coming forward that Beth described. Meeting local standards for green space provision, we should already be doing this. So to me, this is nothing, there's nothing fundamental coming out above and beyond. And where these exist in the development plan, I've yet to find a development plan which doesn't have any mention of local green space standards. So I think that's, but where they don't exist, then all these other things apply, which is the Natural England standards, which are all excellent. And I think the key thing here perhaps is that we're trying to move from just providing open space for the residential development or whatever we're creating to community focused space, which also encompasses and supports wider communities, not just the people you're serving on your site. So there's that wider view, which I think is really positive as well. From a development perspective, we should always be looking wider and looking at how we can bring more people into our site and support the communities that we're bringing development into.
I think one of the things that it's emphasising is when grey belt was first talked about or flagged, there was a suggestion that it was just going to be a few disused car parks in the green belt. But I think what you're saying is and Andy is saying it's much wider.
It's quite fundamental, and there's projects that we've got in at the moment that are being reclassified as grey belt, which are kind of green fields on the edge of villages, that are now being recommended for approval where previously they wouldn't have been. So I think it's having a big impact on sites we're working on.
And we've got kind of pre-apps that we're working on, Eleanor and I are working on sites where officers are saying, can you badge this as grey belt? Because it's what we need you to do for us to get this through our members. They struggle with green belt VSC, kind of that what you used to have to do. If it can be grey belt, there's a lot of councils out there that want you to take that down a grey belt route. They see it as that route to unlocking sites.
I mean, the earlier appeal that you you talked about, I think they did exactly that. They were quite happy to have it designated as grey, or to agree that it should be considered a grey belt. Thank you, Eleanor. That's super. We're running out of time. I don't know how that's happened.
It's so quick, doesn't it?
I've probably rabbited on too much. Questions. Thank you for sending them through. A question in from Lewis, which is about Horsham withdrawing its draft plan as per the inspector's recommendation, questioning whether or not draft allocated sites would still be eligible to access the snow scheme. I guess I don't know is the answer to that question. I'm not sure anyone is clear on that point. Okay, I'm being told to wind up. I'm sorry that we're a bit rushed at the end here. Thanks, that was super. We want you to come back. I know there's loads that you can talk also about B&G and the contribution that you make in terms of that area. Beth and Andy, thanks again. Great input today. Really interesting discussion. Loads in that bill. There's a lot of miles in it to come, and hopefully it's something we can pick up in a future Places and Spaces webinar. Next time round, I think we are going to have a look at B&G, Duchy of Cornwall, who I think you're heavily involved with, and we'll let people know details of that a bit later on. So thanks everybody. Hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you next time.